Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to examine the Thomson article on abortion. Now, as you all know, abortion is a very highly politically charged topic, especially in today's environment with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. In this week, we're going to examine one of the most powerful arguments given in favor of abortion. This is, of course, a polite reminder. You are not required to agree with anything that we look at in class. Instead, our aim is to merely examine the ways in which prominent scholars in the field of biomedical ethics have thought about the moral conflicts involved with medical practices such as abortion. So you do not need to agree with Thomson. I know that I don't agree with Thomson about everything, right? And that is perfectly acceptable. We're instead merely investigating a perspective or a point of view, one that adopts a moderate position on abortion that largely is reflective of the decision in the original Roe versus Wade case. So let's get started. It's interesting that the conversation about abortion is really dominated by what is called a sorities paradox or sorities dilemma, right? The nature of this dilemma is to ask a question like, how many grains of rice do you need in order for it to become a heap, right? In other words, being a heap seems like a vague concept. We don't have like a particular number that we can non-arbitrarily say is what makes this grouping now a heap, this aggregate now a heap. So it seems entirely arbitrary, right, whether we designate a certain number of grains of rice as a heap or not. A similar case, one that is perhaps more interesting or relevant to you all, is how many hairs on your head can you have while you are bald, right? Even people that appear completely bald, right, often have at least some hairs on their head, right? So how many hairs on your head can you have and still be considered bald? It's an open question, and philosophers have traditionally thought that it's impossible to provide a non-arbitrary answer to that problem. Now, the sorities dilemma, sorities paradox, is closely related to the debate on abortion because you can ask a very similar question, a question that very often is centered in especially mainstream political debates on abortion nowadays, which is how many weeks or how long generally until a fetus becomes a person. Right? So conservatives who have generally held that fetuses are persons from the moment of conception, they're likely to regard fetuses at any stage of the pregnancy to be a person with moral interests that we have to consider when arguing about the case of abortion. Now, in contrast, some liberal commentators in defense of abortion as a practice have argued that really personhood happens at a later stage in the pregnancy. So sometimes you'll hear standards like, for example, when a fetus's heart starts beating, whenever their brain develops, and so on, as arguments for later stages in which a fetus becomes a person. Now, I think it's fair to say that philosophers have not made any progress on this issue whatsoever since the sorities dilemma was originally developed in the ancient Greek world over 2,000 years ago. So it's not very likely, according to Thomson's perspective, whether we will have anything like a fully satisfying answer to the question of when, at what stage, does a fetus become a person. So Thomson's strategy then is to just concede to the conservatives that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception, right? Thomson, it seems like to me, doesn't actually believe that, right? But Thomson wants to argue, even if you concede this issue to the conservative, this very intractable issue, she can still nevertheless provide a knockdown argument in favor of abortion, right? So that's why she's conceding this. She wants to make the conservative argument as strong as possible so that she can show that even the strongest possible formulation of the conservative argument is still unsound from her point of view. So let's reconstruct what that conservative argument is. This is going to be the central target of Thomson's essay. In other words, he's going to try to show why this line of thinking is false. The argument goes something like this. In abortion, there's a conflict between the interests of the fetus and the interests of the mother, right? In situations of abortion, the mother wants to bring the pregnancy, wants to terminate the pregnancy, and the fetus has an interest in the pregnancy being taken to term. So the conservative argument then says the fetus's right to life trumps the mother's claim to bodily autonomy. And usually the reasoning for this is just that we need the right to life in order to have any other kind of right. Hence, it's the most important right to preserve, and therefore the interests of the fetus outweigh the interests of the mother. And they consequently infer and conclude that abortion is impermissible. Now, the way that Thomson is going to argue is that Thomson is going to say, okay, you can give the conservatives all of this stuff about when, the fetus becomes a person and starts having moral worth and so on, and still show that this argument against abortion fails. So now let's get into her reasoning as to why. She brings up what is commonly referred to in the literature as the violinist argument. So she asks that you wake up and notice that a violinist has become surgically attached to you by the Society of Music Lovers and now shares your organ system. The violinist's kidney or whatever is shot, right? And they need to be attached to you in order to survive. The violinist needs 9 months to grow healthy enough to become independent once again. Now Thomson asks, are you obligated to, as it were, carry the violinist to term? And Thomson's answer is no, you are not required to do that, right? What is Thomson's argument based on? Well, in essence, what Thomson is arguing is that there's an issue of justice going on here, right? It might be the case that, for example, in this case, the violinist depends, the right to life depends on the violation of your bodily autonomy. But we shouldn't just say, as the conservative argument did, that therefore their interest trumps your interest. To the contrary, there is an issue of justice, right? Your body is your own, and the fact that other people need it to live is irrelevant, right, to your right to your own body. Consequently, there is a direct analogy between the situation of the violinist and the situation of pregnancy. And so for the same reason that you are not obligated to bring the violinist to term, so too you are not obligated to bring a pregnancy to term. In other words, it is appropriate to end a pregnancy through abortion. Now, there are many more arguments to be given about why abortion as a practice is medically necessary. So, for example, half of all abortions that take place in the United States are medical abortions. So they're abortions that are necessary so that the mother can continue to live. And oftentimes in these cases, the fetus will not live either, even if taken to term. Now, in spite of the fact that Thomson takes herself to have definitively refuted the strongest argument in favor of prohibiting abortion, Thomson still calls their own position a moderate position in defense of abortion. Now, why is that? Well, to begin with, Thomson concedes to the conservatives that the fetus is a person who has moral values who are in conflict with that of the mother in the case of abortion. And moreover, that and the reason why Thomson can concede this and still believe that abortion is permissible is because for reasons of justice, the woman has a prior claim to her own body. So, for example, Thomson believes that if you took the conservative argument seriously, then the conservatives' argument would have it that we should all be mandatory organ donors, right? In other words, my right to my own organs, my right to my bodily autonomy is trumped by the right to life of other people, and therefore, right, I should be ready and willing to undergo serious distress, surgery, etc., and the own hit to my own health so as to ensure the right to life of other people. But most people don't think it works that way, right? Well, it might be a very kind, important, benevolent, etc. thing to do to donate one of your organs to someone in need. We do not think of it as morally obligatory, right? And Thomson's reasoning about abortion is an exact analog to this case. But Thomson's account can also explain why it is that we have kind of like an icky feeling about late-term abortions. And in fact, on her account, late-term abortions are worse than early ones, right? They can still be justifiable and so on, right? But they are more morally gray than early abortions, right? And why does Thomson think that? Well, imagine if you had to carry the violinist for like 5 minutes, right? Then Thomson might say, okay, well, you know, the inconvenience to you is such that even a moderately good Samaritan would give up 5 minutes of their own time, right, so as to help out another human being and allow them to live, right? And so we can think about late stage abortions as worse than early ones, right? Why? Well, because the amount of time where you're continue to be inconvenienced by the violinist grows shorter and shorter, such that we would regard it as unreasonable to not carry the violinist to term if the violinist only needed 5 minutes, for example. Now, where does that leave us for days or weeks or a month or something like that? We don't really know, right? But Thomson is already committed to the fact that the fetus has moral worth and that the inconvenience grows lesser and lesser as the abortion or as the pregnancy comes closer to term, so the obligation on the part of the mother grows greater towards the fetus over time. Thomson's argument has been criticized by conservatives for obvious reasons, but Thomson's argument has also been criticized by liberals and leftists, right? Namely, for her not condemnation, but relative condemnation of late-term abortions. We're going to leave things here. I'm very interested. Do you agree with Thomson? Do you think that her case is moderate? Do you think that the violinist is really an analog to the situation where a mother needs to get an abortion? Why or why not? I'll see you in the next video.